friends, welcome to another video. Today we get to finally dig into a topic that has been on my list of something I wanted to look more into since the 10th grade, but you know, now we're here and I get the pleasure of dragging you all with me. First, some explanation. Basically, if you ever find yourself learning ASL or otherwise trying to immerse yourself in deaf culture, there tends to be a list that circulates of like famous deaf and hard of hearing people as a way to remind you not only that deaf folks can be incredibly successful in their lives, but also that more people are deaf and hard of hearing than you actually think. And Juliette Low, the founder of the Girl Scouts, is always somewhere near the top of this list. And when I read that list in the 10th grade, I was like, that's really cool. I should learn more about her at some point. And then didn't. But I think we can still classify this as at some point. It's just like, gosh, well over almost a decade later. Also, for friends who need it before I forget, I'm a white young person with light brown curly hair that's just beyond shoulder length. I'm sitting on a dark gray couch you can see the top of, in front of a plain wall that has some green leaves and some fairy lights above my head. I'm wearing a dark green button up that is the closest thing to a Girl Scout uniform that I own, because I didn't have the foresight to break into my sister's closet and steal her uniform to bring back here to use. Now, Juliette Low, nicknamed Daisy, was born on October 31st, 1860 in Savannah, Georgia. The first couple years of her life were a bit tumultuous due to the Civil War. Her mother was from Chicago and thus very pro-Union, but her father was from Georgia because that's where they lived, and he chose to leave and fight for the Confederacy, which both strained the marriage and created periods of financial and food insecurity for the family. Low herself was constantly ill and easily accident-prone, with frequent earaches and ear infections, at least one of which was treated improperly, which caused partial hearing loss in her right ear. Her childhood of various illnesses also included meningitis, which may have impacted her hearing, and several bouts of malaria, which can also impact hearing. And also, all of the above things can specifically impact inner ear stuff, which can mess with balance, which may explain why she was so accident-prone for much of her early life. When she was little, she was always very focused on trying to help others and creating little communities. Specifically, she formed the Helpful Hands Club with some of her cousins to try to do nice things to help people, with their first initiative being hand-making clothes for the children of local immigrant families. Because they too were children, it didn't go very well and they quickly had to bail on this idea, but that was her first taste of community organizing. Low was also incredibly artistic, specifically enjoying painting, drawing, and sculpture, but was known for being able to figure out just about any sort of art or craft if she put her mind to it, and she often spent her free time outside in nature whenever possible, and all these eccentricities earned her the nickname Crazy Daisy by family and friends. As she grew up, she went to lots of different schools in lots of different places and became a very educated person, but she always struggled immensely with spelling and grammar, so some scholars suspect she may have been dyslexic. And at one of her schools, she joined a sorority that she specifically noted as being incredibly helpful as a sort of like girlhood support system away from home, and the sorority also had a system where they could earn badges through merit and skill, which of course would factor into her later work. In 1880, after her sister passed away, she returned home to take over household duties and help her mother grieve, and while she was there, she met the rich William Mackey Low, who she would marry in 1886. At the wedding, as is tradition, it's much less common now, rice was thrown at the newlywed couple and a piece got lodged in her left ear, creating an infection that, when removed, punctured her eardrum, which made her entirely deaf in that ear. Now, we'll go back to her life timeline in a moment, but the thing that I found incredibly interesting is that that's the extent to which we know anything in the historical record about her deafness. I saw a couple quotes that talked about how it greatly impacted her day-to-day life, but I wasn't able to find any information about how it impacted her life and specifically her communication, because as we'll get to shortly, her entire success as a leader came from her ability to schmooze and communicate with people. So utterly baffled as to why the historical record is just like, yeah, she was pretty deaf, and then that's the end of the conversation. I was able to find some extant footage of her. It's a silent film, so we can't hear her voice to know what she sounded like, but one thing that you can clearly tell from the very brief amount of footage that is her is that she is lip reading. It looks like she's just intently focused on whoever she's speaking with, which I'm sure is probably why she was known for being so kind and intuitive and easy to communicate with, but it's the way that her eyes are focused that makes it very clear that she is trying to figure out what sounds are being produced, more than being intent on the speakers themselves as people, if that makes any sense. You don't know what that specific look is until you know what that specific look is, but she very much has it. There's also a moment where she isn't lip reading and appears to understand what the man next to her said, but he is positioned on her right side. So I'm going to conclude that because she lost her hearing very slowly over the course of her life, she probably got used to lip reading fairly early on with a lot of auditory input, and then as she lost more and more hearing, it just kind of, she became more and more reliant on it, but also her knowledge of what sound sounds looked like filled in some of the gaps. Like, I will say, somebody with an auditory processing disorder, my hearing is fine, but when I have headphones on and I'm lip reading, I can often hear what is being said even if I have no ability to actually physically hear what's being said, because I'm so used to looking at sound. And there have been lots of other records of folks losing hearing over time and having that happen because they actually had been lip reading beforehand and didn't know. So I'm gonna assume that's what took place here, but obviously we can't actually know that. Editing Sydney here, I explained that poorly, so we're gonna give it a second go. What I'm trying to explain is not that, like, oh, people who physically can't hear can actually hear, because that is not true across the board, and it's very different. Each person's experience of hearing loss and of deafness and all of that is very different, and what they experience in their, like, brain version of the mind's eye is as disparate as, like, what blind and low vision people experience, for example. What I'm trying to explain is more the idea that brains sometimes fill in context that no longer exists. That is a thing that can take place. So for a really common example, right, we have synesthesia. Synesthesia is like the neuronal connection between different things that are not typically connected for the average person. So like the most common one is letters having specific colors in somebody's brain, and that being like just natural and normal for them, or numbers having gender, or being able to see certain colors and shapes when they hear certain sounds. Those are all kinds of synesthesia, where the brain is giving you information, sensory information, that is not actually there, right? The most common example I use whenever I bring a synesthesia on this channel is smelling sound, because that's the one that I have. That is, I thought was a thing everybody else experienced, and I learned in high school it's not. But for example, if a certain person gave me a certain song, every time I hear that song after the fact, I smell that person's like cologne or something like that, right? Or if I listen to a song for the first time while I'm cooking a certain meal, the smell of that meal will appear every single time I hear that song again, unless I actively work to unlearn that and replace it with a different scent, which is something I am capable of. This is beside the point. This is a tangent, but anyway, what I'm trying to explain is that there have been some cases, and I wish I could pull sources for you specifically on this, but I couldn't tell you where I've read it, but I've read it in several different places. And I wouldn't even know what to search to try to track it down. But there have been cases where people's brains, especially with voices they know well, like somebody who's in their life, right? Where over time, if they slowly lose their hearing and they're relying on lip reading, their brain can sometimes fill in the sounds that they are not hearing, because it has connected what the lip reading looks like for certain sounds to that audio. And so that just appears in the brain despite them no longer being able to hear that person. It's not super common, as best we know. This is kind of a hard thing to research and to ask about and to know about, right? Because again, to many people, they just think it's normal and they just move on. But that's kind of the concept that I was bringing up here, is that this might have been an example where, because she lost it so slowly over the course of her life, she learned how to manage it, and then her brain just got used to filling in gaps. And so it was no longer to her that much of a disability, except for certain places where it is. Another example of this would be somebody with an auditory processing disorder who only is actually able to get 30% of auditory input when you do the formal tests of that. But because their brain has gotten used to filling in all of those blanks all the time, they have a pretty good hit rate in a normal conversation with a person, so you wouldn't actually notice that they're not actually getting in most of that information, but that's their brain knowing how to fill in gaps based on the thing it is not able to do, not that the brain is capable of doing the task as is typical of the average person completing it. That might have made less sense than the previous description, but hopefully that was somewhat helpful. This doesn't really matter that much for the purposes of this video, because this is all conjecture, right? But it is the explanation that makes the most sense to me, so I wanted to include it. Anyway, this has been a long tangent. Back to the video. I also have not been able to find any anecdotes anywhere about her using a telephone. She may have at some point, but it was never explicitly mentioned anywhere, which may have just been how she had to function. I would imagine probably, but who's to say? Anywho, so after the wedding, she and her husband moved to the UK, where she was expected to become the perfect housewife who uses their great wealth to support charities via writing checks only, and otherwise sticks to the home and looks beautiful and raises the children. But she found this newfound ability to be monetarily involved in local works kind of a dream, and it gave her a chance to be very hands-on in supporting causes that she cared about. She spent much of her time doing charity work, frequently visiting women with leprosy and taking care of the local poor, as well as joining a nursing association, all of which her husband was not a fan of in the slightest. She also picked up more artistic skills, such as blacksmithing, which supposedly made her arm muscles so big that they had to have her gowns consistently tailored because she kept busting out of them. And then it also turned out that she wasn't able to have children, which didn't help in the sense of assimilating into the role of the traditional rich man's wife as was expected from her husband. He ended up taking many hunting trips and traveling often, and she was often ill, so for much of their increasingly strained marriage, they actually saw very little of each other. By 1895, he was out drinking constantly and having various affairs, and he eventually did agree to a divorce, but through the many years of proceedings that were drawn out, he deliberately withheld money from her so she had no way to actually survive and get by. They paused the proceedings in 1905 when he became very ill, and then after he died, it came to light that he had left just about everything he owned to his mistress. His sisters, not a fan of that, so together they contested the will, which took many more years, but eventually by the end of it, Gordon Low would receive the house and the land that were rightfully hers as his widow. After his death, she felt a bit aimless, unsure about what was next for her, because this was a time when not having a man was kind of a problem, for lack of a better way to phrase that. She did a lot more traveling, she did a lot more charity work, and in 1911 she met a British man at a party by the name of Sir Robert Baden-Powell. Now he had just created the Scouting movement, which by the time the two of them met had become the Boy Scouts in the UK, and he talked to her about how many girls were trying to pretend to be boys to join his scouting group, and how his sister, Agnes Baden-Powell, was working on creating girl guides as the girl equivalent. He suggested that she work with Agnes, and so the two of them teamed up, and Juliette would end up creating her own troop in Scotland, followed by two in London. Full of new ideas and excited about the new future of girlhood, she traveled back to Georgia in 1912 and created the first American Girl Guide group with 18 local girls. They learned things like map reading, first aid, cooking, knots, crafts, and played various sports, earning badges for their successful mastering of each skill. Because of her connections with all kinds of elites through her late husband, she was able to spread this idea very quickly, which was good because there were several scouting organizations that were all cropping up as competitors in the same era. Her biggest competitor was the Campfire Girls, which Gordon Low took issue with because they were more heavy on the gender roles and thought it was weird that her girls were learning camping skills and sports, and she actually tried to combine with them, but they declined. That organization still exists today. It became co-ed in 1975, and it's now just known as Campfire. That being said, many of the upper class folks that she talked to thought it was unladylike for their girls to be out in the dirt, so she would host regular fancy tea parties at her home to convince mothers this would actually be very good for their daughters. It was a time of great change in America, with conversations around suffrage and labor reform and public health and women's rights coming to the forefront, and she wanted to make sure that girls were self-sufficient and ready to continue on that work. This was also a time where we're seeing expansions of polio epidemics, and so people are wanting to get their children out of the cities during the summer. And organizations like the YMCA, like Girl Scouts, like any other sort of camping scouting organization was a really great way for parents to sign their kids up for a thing that supports them in the city and then gets them out of the city in the summertime. So that's part of why we're seeing such an expansion of these concepts. First of all, because they were new, but also because there was great need for them in this time period. Gordon Low also remodeled the carriage house behind her home to be the official headquarters of the organization and a core meeting space, and they officially changed the name from Girl Guides to Girl Scouts in 1913 as chosen by the girls of the troop. The Baden-Powells blessed this name change, but they decided to continue using Girl Guide in the United Kingdom. So that's why they have Girl Guides and we have Girl Scouts, but both have Boy Scouts. In 1913, they also acquired an official national headquarters in Washington, D.C., and Gordon Low designed and patented the trefoil badge design and published her first scouting book titled How Girls Can Help Their Country. The organization drastically expanded at the start of the First World War, partnering with the Red Cross to make surgical dressings and knitting clothing for soldiers. Older girls would volunteer with wounded soldiers wearing their scouting uniforms, and the selling of white flags with the Red Cross to help raise money. They participated in soup kitchens, they organized to help grow, harvest, and can food for the war effort. Hoobert Heever wrote to Gordon Low multiple times to thank her and her girls for their hard work. Oh no, another random tangent from editing, Sydney. I'm so sorry. But if you're wondering why after that sudden cut I look like I've been crying, the reason is because I remembered a fun fact, and the fun fact had me giggling to the point of tears for a full 5 minutes of footage that I removed for you. You're welcome. But I am going to tell you the fun fact so then you also know it. And that fun fact is that one of the oldest recorded radio bloopers is a man going to introduce the then president of the United States, Herbert Hoover, and he calls him Hoobert Heever. And now every time I have to say Herbert Hoover, which isn't often, but every time I have to think really hard about it because I will say Hoobert Heever, and then I just start giggling because Hoobert Heever is hilarious. So anyway, that's what that was, and the radio clip is on the internet, so you are welcome to Google that in your free time. It is as funny as you think it's going to be. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. Sorry for the tangent. During the war, the headquarters moved from Washington, D.C. to New York City. Then in 1923, Gordon Low developed breast cancer, which she chose to keep as quiet as possible and continued to work until she was no longer able, dying in Georgia in January of 1927. She was buried in her Girl Scout uniform. In 1948, she was honored via postage stamp, something that required a joint resolution of Congress to allow the post office to honor a civic organization for the first time in its history. And then in 1965, her birthplace became a National Historic Landmark. It is a museum you can and should visit. They have lots of her scouting stuff there, but also a lot of her artwork, which is really cool. And then in May of 2012, she was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The Girl Scouts would go on to become one of the largest organizations for girls in the world, with over 3 million active scouts and 50 million alumni in the United States. And before you get on me about saying alumni instead of alumnae because it's a girls' organization, trans people exist. Also, actually, Girl Scouts has been formally gender inclusive since 2011, stating that they have always been about inclusiveness and are not in the business of harming children. Notably, Girl Guides in the UK have banned trans members, but Girl Scouts stand strong. There's a list, which I will link below, of probably hundreds of trans Girl Scouts that you can order cookies from online if this is really making you crave a Thin Mint. I am so sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but apparently there is a season of Girl Scout cookie selling, and it ends on March 29th, at least this year, which I don't remember when this video is coming out, but I'm working on my April content right now, so it's got to be somewhere in April, which is after March 29th, which means you can no longer buy Girl Scout cookies, but you can save this, and next year you can buy from trans Girl Scouts, and that would be super rad of you. Regarding inclusion, early Girl Scout troops were segregated where that was typical and or the law, but troops of all kinds affiliated with the organization appeared very early on and were given free rein to do so. The first African American troop was founded in 1917, the first American Indian troop in 1921, and the first Mexican American troop in 1922. There was an article in 1952 in Ebony magazine, a monthly magazine centered around African American news and issues if you're not aware of its existence, that reported that Girl Scouts, even in the South, were making great progress on working through racial barriers and creating integrated spaces. The age groups have changed a lot since the beginning, but the general structure is that there's like the overall troop, and the beneath that are individual patrols, and those are divided by age group. The general patrols were brownies, age 7 to 9, intermediates, age 10 to 13, and seniors, aged 14 to 18. But many groups have been added and shifted over the years, like the addition of the daisies for kindergartners and first graders in 1984. Today, it is daisies first, as kindergarten and first grade, brownies as second and third, juniors as 4th and 5th, cadets as 6th to 8th, seniors as 9th to 10th, and ambassadors as 11th to 12th. A lot of the major reshuffles of the system happened specifically in the 1960s, where membership was hit by the baby boom and massively expanded, so they needed to do something new with all of the extra Girl Scouts that they had. In the 1990s, they did a Right to Read service project participated in by nearly 4 million Girl Scouts to work on issues of illiteracy. In 2000, they formed the Girl Scout Research Institute, which focuses on research about girls, often in relation to creating public policy, and I learned that the majority of women NASA astronauts are Girl Scout alums. 3 out of 3 women who have served as US Secretary of State are Girl Scout or Girl Guide alums, which is pretty cool. I will also say that 2 out of the 3 women who have served as US Secretary of State are graduates of Seven Sisters colleges as well. I would imagine if you start comparing the Girl Scout statistics with the women's college statistics on success in various fields, there would be a massive amount of overlap, which makes sense, right? When we think about the history of patriarchy and what being in a space outside of your home environment that encourages you to be resourceful and self-sufficient and speak your mind does to create confidence and resilience and future success. Gendered spaces are incredibly complicated and nuanced and weeds we will not get into today, but specifically affinity spaces for marginalized folks can be really, really impactful. I've never done a college tour of an HBCU, but I would imagine that they have much the same speech about their massive list of famous alumni that credit being educated in an affinity space as a huge portion of their success and their confidence to pursue that success in a world that is against them in the same way that every single women's college does. When you start going through the history of the environments in which famous trailblazers grew up and or were educated, these things tend to pop up a lot, and for good reason. But anyway, you probably want to learn about the cookies and get on with your day rather than listen to a diatribe about affinity spaces, and that is very fair of you. So let's talk about cookies. First of all, since Thin Mints were introduced, they have been consistently the most popular cookie, which is the correct answer. Also, if you haven't eaten them frozen, you're missing out. Go store your Thin Mints in the freezer. You're welcome. The first association between Girl Scouts and cookies was actually in 1917, so pretty shortly after they were created. And this was in Oklahoma, where a group of scouts decided decided to learn how to bake cookies as one of their projects, and then they sold them to raise money in the local high school cafeteria. In 1922, the American Girl magazine, which is a Girl Scout specific publication that I believe no longer exists, included a recipe for simple sugar cookies that many troops then baked and sold door to door to fundraise for various camping trips and adventures and such. As they became known for these cookies over the next decade, Philadelphia would become the first to switch to commercially baked cookies rather than those everybody made in their mom's home kitchen. A few years later, a New York City troop would create a cookie cutter in the shape of the trefoil badge and began selling those commercially. This was the first time the box itself was branded as Girl Scout. There was a large cookie drop-off during the Second World War due to rationing, obviously, so they switched to calendars for a couple years, which was obviously less successful. But then by 1951, there were three kinds of cookies: sandwich cookies, shortbread cookies, and what were then known as chocolate mints. Girls began selling them at tables in shopping malls and markets rather than just door to door. By 1956, they had expanded even more in their flavors. Commercialization and standardization continued to change incrementally over the next 60-ish years. I can do math on the fly, don't worry about it. And then in 2014, they created an order website for the first time so people could sell online and girls could learn about things like digital marketing. Because of the popularity of Girl Scout cookies and the large alumni base, the organization is pretty much entirely self-sufficient in funding itself, including all of its various camps and troops and trainings and everything else. I don't mean this video to sound like I'm advertising the Girl Scouts. I just always imagine them as being like this tiny group of maybe 10 total scouts who build things with pipe cleaners at a local library and fill my house with boxes of cookies. That was always my job to sort. I think my sister stopped scouting when I was in like elementary school and I never got into it, so my frame of reference is, needless to say, a little bit wonky, but it was really cool to learn here what they really stand for and all of the genuine work that they have done, not just to help local communities, but also to learn skills and tools outside of a home environment that set them up to be leaders. And then on top of that, to know all this is started by a woman who was both deaf and chronically ill for most of her life as a single woman at a time when women had very little agency makes it even more incredible. I'm so glad that I got to learn this history along with you today. I hope that you learned something cool and had a good time. Tell me about your experiences in the Girl Scouts if you ever were one, or what your favorite cookie is. I think I've made my answer pretty clear. I do think that I've only ever actually eaten the Thin Mints and the peanut butter chocolate ones, so maybe my opinion doesn't matter because I don't have enough data to actually form a solid opinion. Anyway, as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.